It's been a blessing, and um, it's got into people's homes in a way that has not been always possible to do physically. So you never know what God's going to do. We just had somebody else join us from India. For those who don't know, Falguni's just joined us from India. So God is at work in unexpected places and in ways we don't always anticipate. So it's my job for not for too long tonight. We'll end with another song, that Is He Worthy song that Chaba played at the beginning of this. But as far as Thursdays are concerned, not Sundays, I'm going to leave you for the next month. What I hope is ringing in your ears is an exhortation to pray. If you have a moment or two, some mums and dads are awfully busy. Some people are frighteningly busy in work. Other people have lots of time, but I'm exhorting you to just, I don't mean necessarily get on your knees. I don't mean necessarily close your eyes and put your hands together, but I do mean develop a consciousness of God. That's what Chaba called it just now. And the habit of looking to God for him to work. Well, how am I going to encourage you to do that tonight and leave you with something that might stick at odd times over the next few weeks? Remember, Jesus modeled a life of prayer. We can't read the Gospels without understanding how much and how often Jesus withdrew and collected his heart. I mean, this is the Lord, this is God in flesh, and he found it necessary to spend time with God, with his Father. And the life he modeled for us was not some kind of unattainable or extraordinary way for a human being to live. From the moment Saul became the Lord's on a Damascus road, we're told his heart turned to prayer. I mean, it doesn't mean he was prostrate day and night on his hands or on his face. Paul was probably busier than anybody else in the church. Paul actually said, look, I worked harder than anybody else. I went to more places. I got into all sorts of circumstances. But Paul, the testimony of Paul from the time he met the Lord was, behold, he's praying. And Paul said of himself, it comes out in what he says, that he prayed excessively. He prayed night and day. And it was Paul who was able to keep on the line of telling the different churches in different places, pray without ceasing. You might be doing other things, but you can still have a heart attitude which is looking to God and seeking his face, even when you have to be occupied with other things. The story I really wanted to share tonight was the story of the beginning of the guy Nehemiah, who did so much for God's ancient people in terms of after they'd lost the land. Israel had been unfaithful and they were thrown out of the place where God wanted them to dwell, and they spent 70 years in captivity and in exile. And then gradually the Lord restored his people, and Nehemiah was the guy who was the person who rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem and he was an amazing man. Did anybody happen to know what his job was before he was allowed back to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem? Somebody might know.
Well, taste the king's food to see if it's poisoned.
Yes. Yes, that's absolutely right, Sarko. In English, the translation is, I was the king's cupbearer.
Cupbearer.
Yeah. He was the, I don't know what people who go to posh restaurants, he was the wine expert and tasted the cup to make sure that nobody was trying to get it at the king. Well, early on in the story of Nehemiah, the first chapter shows us that before anything happened which was so important to the restoration of the walls of Jerusalem, Nehemiah was a great man of prayer. What chapter 1 of Nehemiah tells us is that somebody came back from Jerusalem and told Nehemiah what was happening and how the walls were all broken down and the people were in an unreformed state. And it drove Nehemiah to the habit of praying night and day and before the Lord for many, many days. He was a man of great prayer. And at the end of chapter 1, it just throws in a little phrase that he says, I spent months fasting and praying. I wanted to hear the news of Jerusalem, and I was the king's cupbearer. And then chapter 2 of Nehemiah starts with the next thing that happened, that he hadn't been on duty for quite a while. I don't know if he'd had a few days off annual leave, but anyway, he was back on duty as the king's cupbearer and doing his job, making sure the wine was where it ought to be. And well, does anybody know what happened? The king turned to him, and somebody might know why there was a sudden crisis appeared for Nehemiah. It came out of nowhere, really. The king turned to Nehemiah as he was serving the wine. It's in chapter 2 of Nehemiah, and said, your face is desperately sad. This is nothing. That's it. Mariana's got it. Why is your face so sad? Mariana sent a message. Why is your face sad? Now, that was a very, very, very serious business. To be, this was the most powerful man in the world. And what the historians tell us was that if anybody you weren't allowed into the king's presence with a sad face. Potentially, that was the end of you. That was curtains. That's it. You're gone. You're dead. It was punishable by death to be sad in the presence of the king. Wow. And it does actually tell us in Nehemiah that Nehemiah was scared stiff. Well, wouldn't you be? And then it says an interesting thing. And the king asked, why are you sad? This is you've got sadness of heart. It's written all over your face, Nehemiah. You're not the happy person that your job requires you to be. And Nehemiah, understandably, was really frightened. And the story we're told is that he issued what you could call an emergency prayer. The story says, I prayed to God in a moment of unexpected and pretty threatening crisis. Nehemiah prayed to God, and something amazing happened. The king, in charge and in power of every resource that his empire had at his disposal, said, all right, Nehemiah, go back and do what you want to do. And he gave him safe passage, and he gave him resources, And the story develops from there, how despite many oppositions and all sorts of tricks to try and throw Nehemiah off doing what God wanted him to do, from then on, Nehemiah journeyed back to Jerusalem, did much good for the people, and got the walls of Jerusalem rebuilt. My point really is this. Nehemiah was able to issue an emergency prayer, and sometimes you and I might have to issue an emergency prayer. But it was built on a foundation of a habit of prayer. It was, how could we put it? Nehemiah had built up an investment in the bank of prayer, and was therefore able to make a sudden large withdrawal if he needed to. And he did need to, and God answered him. But it was an emergency prayer in a sudden, very threatening situation. But his reaction demonstrated that this man had, in secret, we're told about it in chapter 1, had developed a prayer life. And when he needed to draw on it, he could draw on it. He did draw on it. And God, well, in a way, you could say it was one of the critical moments in the life of God's ancient people, because God answered his prayer, and that enabled Jerusalem to be defended again. How are you and I doing in developing a habit of looking to God, so that when we really do need to make an emergency withdrawal, there's a bank, there's a stance before the Lord which gives us confidence? Because one thing Nehemiah did not lack when really threatened, I picture it, I imagine all the other courtiers looking at him when the king said, "You've got sadness of heart." And I can imagine perhaps a room full of all people waiting on the king. There would have been a sharp intake of breath all around that room. And everybody suddenly looking askance at Nehemiah. Is this it? Are you finished, mate? Have you done something you should not have done in the presence of the king? Actually, Nehemiah was as bold as brass. He said, "Well, of course I'm sad. My people are in trouble and I should be able to do something about it." Well, that story, it does speak to me, because Nehemiah developed a prayer life. It doesn't mean that he wasn't occupied with other things. I imagine he had to be an expert in wine, not wine from California or some of those lovely wines from Veneto in Italy, or our not so good English wines, but in the ancient wines and that world, he would have been a busy man. To have been the king's cupbearer, it meant he had quite an, I don't know if it was a well-paid job, but it would have been a busy job. But it didn't stop him developing a prayer life. And ultimately, and I'm speaking to myself here, it's not a matter always of finding days and days to wait on the Lord, but it is a matter of getting the discipline for my heart to be, we've been using a word tonight that Damien used, more focused on God. More focused on God. And I speak to myself, we must come out of these circumstances more focused on God. And Nehemiah wasn't the only story. I'm going to stop in a few minutes, but there's a similar story with Daniel. Daniel was a busy man. Daniel had a position of influence, and Daniel only had such revelation from God because he developed the habit, whatever else he had to do. And remember, they gave Daniel, as it became obvious to the people in power that Daniel was a man of understanding who could be trusted, Daniel was in charge of all sorts of things. He was a busy man, but he developed the habit of looking to God. There was a man called Daniel. He prayed to God 3 times a day. And we can do it. You and I can do it. You and I can do it. Yeah, somebody gave me a lift the other day in one of those Toyota self-charging hybrids. And it's a funny experience, you know, because they go along the road without an engine on, and then an engine cuts in at unexpected times, and you can hear the engine starting up, and it's got nothing to do with whether you're accelerating or braking, but there is a connection between that engine working and the power that drives the car. And it's a bit like, to me, you know, we have to have an engine of prayer. It may not be directly connected to the circumstances we face in front of us, but God gives us grace that you and I become people who look to him, so that whatever the circumstances in front of us are, our habit of heart is to look to him. You know, I was reading about just in Hebrews 11, and when Daniel, they found him praying, they found an excuse to get at him for praying 3 times a day and not bowing down to the statue of the world leader and all the rest of it. Well, Daniel got thrown in a lion's den. We know the story. We're almost too familiar with it. But Hebrews tells us it was through faith Daniel stopped the mouth of the lions. It wasn't just luck. It wasn't just God overruling. It was through Daniel's faith. Daniel's faith stopped the mouth of the lion. How did Daniel, when he was thrown in a lion's den, have the faith to just stand before God, trusting him, even though the lions' mouths would not have been stopped if he wasn't in faith? Well, he developed the habit of looking to God. So that's my little exhortation to you tonight. I hope we can pick this up, maybe take a different tack and have fellowship in a different way in September. But I'm making a little charge to you. Develop the habit of looking to God, and develop it regardless of the circumstances. Develop build up a bit of an investment account of prayer, because you and I never know when we might need it and might need to look to him. Well, I probably said more than enough for tonight. I'm very happy if anybody wants to come back to me on this message, which I am harping on about, and Helen shared a little story on about the fact that you and I, you and I can become people who have a prayer life, and it has standing with God, and we can draw on it when we need to. Amen. Amen.